let's talk about finding that middle path that might help you avoid collapse in your narcissistic relationship. Now, one of the most challenging elements of managing narcissistic relationships is that if you cannot fully leave the relationship and you have to keep engaging, for example, you're co-parenting minor children, it's a family member and you can't distance, a workplace thing, that you can't really engage and you have to monitor your reactions and you have to tamp down your emotions. And the reasons for this are to steer clear of the gaslighting, avoiding the narcissistic rage, and their cruel ways of fighting and conflict, and to stop having the same arguments over and over again. That is when it becomes strategic. But even when it is strategic, having to basically sort of dissociate from your normal emotional reactions and constantly keep pushing things down, even when you radically accept and know what you are dealing with, it takes a toll. But before you fully get it, it's not strategic. You may stop responding, not to disengage, but because you are numb, because you feel helpless, because your system gets overwhelmed. And while at those times, sure, some people do get and do feel dysregulated and may fight back, most people actually just start to shut down. And we see a sort of numb, mildly dissociated person who is in the narcissistic relationship and often managing the shame and self-blame of the relationship. This can also be a prelude to the complete collapse of a person in one of these relationships, which can happen when you do not understand what you are up against. The struggle is that the management strategies, when you can't leave, can look a little like what happens when you're in the relationship and still don't get it. And this gets tricky. How do you disengage from a narcissistic relationship without risking going fully back into numbing and collapse? When we are in abusive, invalidating, or otherwise harmful relationships, especially when the relationship is not physically abusive or loomingly physically dangerous, most people fight back, at least initially. We push back on our reality being doubted, we push back on the criticisms and insults, but the trauma bonding slowly sets in and the gaslighting becomes more prevalent. And our wanting to remain attached and connected remains an almost more compelling higher order pull. And as a result, we start opening the gates to wondering if some of what the narcissistic person is saying to us is true. And if we are fighting back, that we're actually part of the conflict and we're part of the issue and the problem. We start to believe that we're complicit and we want it to work. That switch from what was originally a healthily intentioned fight and us exerting our autonomy starts to fade when we stay in one of these relationships too long. And any fight that comes up in us down the road may be more trauma response and protection than us really exerting our individuality. And the problem is that many people in these relationships, if they don't know what they are up against and do not understand narcissism or trauma bonding, start heading into numbness, like I said, and then ultimately collapse, a sort of heavy-duty apathy. Why bother? A sort of soul deadening. This collapse state is when people stop caring for themselves, may not really even be that able to care for other people, may not be engaged in any kind of meaningful and purposeful activity. It is sort of an ultimate psychological defeat. The point of the work I do in all of what I do, teaching, training, what I talk about on this channel, and in my work at large, and all the therapists who do the work, the kind of work I do in the world of narcissistic relationships, is to stop all of these things that are happening in one of these relationships before it gets to collapse. because it is harder to get people lifted out of that. And the double issue is that because not everyone can leave every relationship that is like this, is to also work to ensure that in trying to cope with these relationships, that you don't get so lost in the disengagement that you take yourself back to numbness and collapse. That's the tricky middle path. So that's the big question. You can get that, you're really in a great place, but really, how do we do that? Number 1, number 2, and number 3. You have got to understand how narcissistic and antagonistic and toxic relationships work. And even more important, to be curious about your responses to the relationship. And to not just write yourself as a codependent or someone who attracts toxic people, but that your ongoing engagement in this and the reactions it brings up, and sometimes reactions you don't like it brings up, are often about protection and safety within yourself, and are really manifesting or showing how broken up inside you are, how fragmented you had to become so you could stay safe and attached. Sometimes we may call it our version of crazy love, but it isn't some irrational, obsessive thing. It's merely an attachment and safety behavior to an unsafe person and situation. You aren't crazy. You're being harmed. There's a difference. As you understand some of this territory and recognize that there is not something wrong with you, but that you are in a bad situation with someone who is not behaving in a healthy manner, and frankly is behaving in a harmful manner in this relationship, and who will come up to you and say that they love you, but never protect you, a more coherent awareness sets into you. And as that more coherent awareness sets in, you can work towards not seeing yourself as being complicit in this relationship. And none of this can happen without you having support. Safe, empathic, validating, consistent, protective, and attuned people. And this is not easy to find if you have been isolated in a narcissistic relationship or from a narcissistic family system. You may have lost relationships in the course of being in this relationship. You may have felt limited from creating new ones and not have been able to maintain the ones you had, or felt too ashamed to seek out support or talk to the supports you have. The only way to heal from a harmful relationship is in a healthy relationship. For relational spaces and attachment to feel safe again. You can't do that in your head. You have to do it with others. So when you do have ongoing contact with a narcissistic person, there are a few other things you can do. Prepare for it. It's like studying for a test or packing for a trip. You prepare. And that means a few deep breaths. Remind yourself to not go deep. By that I mean don't defend, don't engage, don't explain, don't personalize. Really lean into the idea that it's not you. Touch into the why you're having to interact with this person. You may have good reasons. Maybe you're in touch with them because it's a bridge to staying in touch with other family members you actually care about. Or maybe it's to protect and keep your kids' world sane, and you have to because of the co-parenting agreement. Or maybe because you like your job or parts of your job, or you need your job to survive until you find a new one. Whatever it may be, that there is something bigger here than dealing with someone who drains you. And you also have to take care of yourself on the back end. You will be tired and depleted. And that may mean, if you can, going to bed earlier, try to get some physical activity, building some pleasure or something that you look forward to in your day, or some kind of nice break, talking to a friend, something to come down off of that interaction. Doing these things intentionally reminds us that these are not easy situations. And doing these things can fortify us and give us clarity so we don't collapse and we don't normalize these encounters and we don't think that this is how life always is, and we stop blaming ourselves. It's important that we remember that not every relationship is like this. It's a real balancing act for survivors to not get caught up in a current of just getting numb or close to collapse when you keep interacting with a narcissistic person. realistic awareness, radical acceptance, coherent narratives, not blaming yourself, understanding what these relationships are about, having some sources of support and caring for yourself are all essential to being able to avoid getting pulled into that riptide, because it is really hard to pull out of that riptide and out of the collapse. Yes, you will feel like shit after these encounters with them, but to be aware that it is a heavy lift and there's not something wrong with you becomes a way to find one of the many middle paths that we need to find to heal. I hope you can find one for yourself. Thanks again.